Welcome everyone to today's webinar on payer analytics use cases and technology based on Chilmark Research's latest report, 2019 Healthcare Payer Analytics Market Trends Report. I'm Hannah Enley, Chilmark's Marketing Manager and today's webinar moderator. Before we begin, I should note we are recording this webinar and will include it in our follow-up email. If you have any questions during the presentation or discussion, please submit them via the Questions tab in the GoToWebinar panel next to the presentation screen. We will address them at the end of the webinar as part of the discussion. Next, I'd like to introduce Chilmark Research. We are an analyst firm dedicated to helping organizations adopt, deploy, and use IT to improve the healthcare experience through our high-quality, objective research and advice. Today's webinar presenter is Research Director and Report Author, Brian Murphy. Brian leads Chilmark's research on analytics, interoperability, and population health. Most recently, Brian wrote the Provider Analytics Report, which is a companion to this report, which we published earlier this year. With that, Brian, would you like to tell us about your research on payer analytics?
Yes, indeed, Hannah. I'd love to talk about that. As Hannah just told you, this report is really the second in a series that we've done on healthcare analytics in 2019. The first one came out just before HIMSS this year and zeroed in on the tools and kind of trends that are happening in the provider space. In this report, we kind of turned our attention to what payer organizations are doing with some of the most widely deployed and or most forward-looking solutions on the market. Now, when we say payer, we are referring to any organization that pays for healthcare. So this would be your health insurance carriers, like your national payers or Blue Cross Blue Shield payers locally, individual health plans inside of these larger organizations, employers, unions, government agencies. We were interested in hearing what vendors have for any of those different segments. Now, across all of these products and the vendors, there were a pretty large number of different use cases, but there is a common thread, and that is zeroing in on understanding both the kind of cost effectiveness and the efficacy of the direct patient care that these providers are paying for. And this almost invariably includes some insight into both the cost variability and the outcomes variability that a lot of folks are obsessed about nowadays. Over the last 18 months, we talked to roughly 40-ish vendors who've got some kind of product or solution that fits in one way or another in this market. Some of those did not meet the minimum requirements that we show on this slide right here. Some declined to participate. Some we weren't able to get enough information to really do the vendor justice. So for a variety of different reasons, we winnowed that 40 plus down to 18 vendors, and we provide fairly detailed profiles of each of these vendors, as well as an overall comparison of all the vendors in the report itself. And we're going to kind of hit a lot of the high points from that today in this webinar. Now, we summarize our overall comparison in a chart that we call a Chilmark Bearing, and I'm going to share that with you towards the end of this webinar. We organize all of these vendors, the 18 vendors, into three not necessarily exclusive categories. There are claims analytics vendors who use, as the name implies, primarily paid claims to support their applications. There are clinical analytics vendors who use those same claims data sources supplemented with EHR-derived data. And there are also a bunch of companies who lead with services, but those services are anchored in technology in one shape or another. From a high-level standpoint, these are some of the key takeaways. Traditionally in this market, vendors have concentrated on using claims data to understand the how and to a lesser extent the why of healthcare spend. The reports and dashboards that we looked at for this report contain a truly enormous amount of detailed information about different cost categories, as well as a particular focus on high-cost events, particularly those around hospitals. So that would include things like ED visits and admissions and signal hospitalizations as well. The philosophy behind a lot of this kind of reporting is to identify cost hotspots, patients who are high cost, providers or practices or locations or hospitals whose costs are higher than they should or could be. And the idea is to enable a systematic approach involving a lot of different parties to addressing cost variability. So benchmarking provider performance is an important part of these products. The benchmarks that you see here focus very heavily on cost and quality performance for a bunch of different reasons. Payers use these in order to develop, to try to optimize the balance between cost and quality. They want lower cost providers, but they also want providers who provide high quality care. Payers also need to use these products to assemble quality information that they need as a matter of accreditation in their states. Payers, for the most part, have pretty much no access to clinical data sources outside of different kinds of value-based contracts. While there's no simple solution to this problem, the overall environment could be changing based on some of the things that are happening in Washington, D.C. Both the Office of the National Coordinator, which is the organization that was responsible for dispersing the EHR incentive program funds, and HHS writ larger are in the process of rolling out new interoperability rules that have to do with patient data. Now, the final format of those, there are a lot of very controversial provisions in the various kind of proposed versions of these rules. But we're expecting final versions in the next, potentially next month or so. And there is hope that that's going to increase the ability of patients to make their data available to more and different players in the healthcare, include payers, presumably. The information blocking rules would also make data available in places where it traditionally hasn't been. Value-based care has been a fairly significant catalyst for payers to invest in new analytics as well. The whole sort of long-term transition from fee-for-service based to value-based delivery has really kind of turned people's heads in terms of getting payers and providers to cooperate using data. To the extent that there's an Achilles heel to a lot of these products, it's in the area of actionability. Getting a user to act based on information that may show up in a report or dashboard is not exactly like falling off a log. Payers want to deliver higher quality care, lower costs, but they can't do it on their own. They are one step removed from actual care delivery. So we've seen a lot of the vendors that are featured in this report become part of some fairly creative efforts by payers to get better engagement from providers. So incentive programs, different kinds of outreach programs, network development programs. But I would be remiss if I didn't, admit that there's really no silver bullet to the problem of actionability. But we are certainly in an environment where there's quite a bit of experimentation taking. Before we get into our overall conclusions and our Chilmark Bearing, et cetera, I want to spend some time describing some of the characteristics of the product portfolios that we've had a chance to see over the last 18 months. So first of all, the applications that we saw as we prepared this report are fairly broad, and they encompass a lot of different aspects of a payer's business. But it's kind of useful to look at them in terms of what they do at a high level and how the underlying technology, the things that are used to build these applications, the implications of that technology in terms of what they're able to do. So I want to put these applications from a functional standpoint in the context of the old Gartner Analytics maturity model. There's lots of different variations on this model, but I think most people are familiar with the kind of basic idea, which is that analytics and reporting at its most basic is descriptive. It describes in kind of categories what's already happened using data that was collected along the way. So the world as it is. As these kinds of applications become more mature, that is, as they become more functional and capable, they're able to provide better insight into what will happen, so actual predictions, and eventually provide recommendations about what should happen. So, as we sort of move up the maturity curve, we begin to see more predictive and more prescriptive kinds of results coming out of these kinds of products. Now, the applications from the vendors in this report are primarily and heavily descriptive, but that is not to say that they are not predictive and prescriptive. They also provide a range of predictions, especially for kind of costs and hospital-based utilization. And they also support recommendations to one extent or another. So another way to kind of look at these applications, and we show this sort of across the bottom of the slide, where we make a distinction between mainstream and advanced analytics. And this really has more to do with how these things are built, the actual software components that go into constructing these products. Every single product in this report is mainstream in the sense that it relies on conventional data warehousing techniques, commercial relational databases, ETL tools that people are already familiar with to build an analytics data store. The vendors then build their applications on this store. They also make these data stores accessible with commercial BI tools. Many of the products inside this report are advanced in the sense that they rely on what most people consider advanced technologies. So things like NoSQL databases, artificial intelligence, machine learning, programming techniques, and different kinds of data science approaches and methodologies. Now, there's a pervasive belief that these kind of advanced technologies, these advanced analytics, is going to support, what we consider more mature analytics, predictive and prescriptive analytics. And increasingly, the vendors are beginning to offer some of these advanced analytics to customers who are able to take advantage of them. And the sorts of workbenches that they are talking about at this point are still mainly geared to programmers, developers, and secondarily to sort of power analysts who live in user organizations. As I said, that these products provide functionality for a pretty large number of different payer use cases, but a few of these were present to one degree or another in nearly every vendor's product portfolio. Cost reporting is an important element across the board here. The organization and presentation of this of cost information varies from vendor to vendor, but it's often kind of organized around service lines, insurance product type, contract, the provider organization itself, PCPs frequently, and honestly, more often than not, it's organized in multiple different ways depending on the vendor that we're talking about. And the goal is to provide some kind of insight into the things that are driving cost, and with an eye toward kind of redesigning processes, building incentives, devising interventions that can kind of address those costs. It is not, cost for the pure sake of managing cost. It's also for the sake of refining existing clinician networks. Another important category of use case addresses the needs of payers in risk-based contracts with providers. So whether it's an ACO type arrangement, Medicare Advantage contract, or some form of managed care, these applications allow both parties in a contract to kind of understand and manage cost and quality performance. And this usually involves finding and filling different kinds of care gaps to meet care quality goals. So if there is a prototypical application among this group of vendors, it is for Medicare Advantage support. A large number of the products in this report have specific capabilities to help payers improve star rating performance, usually by filling care gaps. This also usually includes some ability to kind of find opportunities to increase the risk adjustment factor, and those opportunities are then treated as another kind of care gap. It's very normal to see some kind of revenue cycle or payment analytics type offering in these products that kind of let a payer figure out who's good, bad, or indifferent at billing, and also kind of reduce and manage instances of fraud, waste, and abuse. Nearly every product has some kind of steerage capability. So this is the idea that people need to be made aware, that members need to be made aware of alternative places to find high quality, lower cost options when it makes sense and when it's appropriate. I want to talk about data for a bit here. So analytics is only as good as the data that fuels it. As I've kind of already said, paid claims are the primary and for a great number of vendors, exclusive data source for these products and solutions. Claims data is usually time-lagged and it's updated on a monthly cycle, but claims data has that cross-care venue perspective that no single provider data source really has. Provider data, on the other hand, particularly EHR data, have a wealth of kind of clinical color and observations that just don't make it into claims. Provider data also is current, often up to the minute. But as I've noted before, payers traditionally have had no access to provider EHR data except in the context of ACOs and other kinds of VBC contracts. But I guess at this point and with this report, we're kind of going on the record saying that the combination of clinical and claims data will be the kind of minimum data set for analytics and reporting as we edge closer to downside risk being a real part of what providers are experiencing. We feel like that aggregated combination of claims and EHR data is optimal to support, if we really want to move the needle in terms of the value delivered by analytics and reporting in healthcare. There is also this exploding universe of new data sources that exists, patient-related data, things like social determinants, precision medicine, are poised, according to some, to really provide or really to enable a whole new level of precision when it comes to using patient data for the kinds of purposes that these applications serve. This, I think, for the most part, points to a real need for better ways to aggregate data for analytics and reporting. I mean, a lot of the vendors in this report do a fantastic job, but I feel like we're really just at kind of early days in terms of aggregation for the purposes of analytics and reporting. So we're seeing a lot of vendors offering up what can only be described as a data integration or data provisioning platform. The idea is to take a process that has historically been kind of labor intensive, requires skilled developers, people who understand the data and its various expressions and combination, and introducing more automation into the process of kind of taking it from source to building an analytics ready data store. A lot of time, these vendors are talking about using AI and ML to find patterns in the data that conventional techniques don't surface. But for now, a lot of these data platforms really are not, they're not quite one-stop shops for data integration or data provisioning, in the sense that a bunch of data types and data contributors might be out of scope for different vendors. But the goal, I think, for a handful of vendors in this report is to be that one-stop shop for data integration. Predictive analytics. I said that it's kind of a here and now capability for most of these vendors, but I do want to mention that the predictions that are on offer are mostly confined to it's a relatively small set of predictions. The likelihood of things like ED visits or hospitalizations or costs or the risk of rising costs. Now, if you look across the vendors, these predictions are based either on commercially available or proprietary to the vendor, that is, risk models. The commercially available models, many of which are from vendors who occur in this report, provide a pretty well accepted, for the most part, trusted way to arrive at a fairly narrow set of predictions. But I do feel that at this point, the proprietary models can be just as good and have the advantage that they don't necessarily require a license from any other vendor. Which leads us to one thing that most vendors don't talk about too much. We feel like they should be, and that is the accuracy of their predictions. We feel like prediction accuracy is a potential competitive differentiator, and for people who buy this report and are in the market for this kind of product, we always encourage them to ask the vendor to provide a little bit more information about how often their predictions actually work out. So gradually and over time, we feel like we're going to kind of move beyond the predictions that we have today, which are sort of broad brush calculations of, the likelihood of a particular kind of costs or particular events in a narrowly defined kind of planning horizon. And the technology is going to evolve to deliver more specific, more accurate predictions, and predictions about alternative turns of events, alternative actions that providers and payers could take. So we see that questions like you see here on this slide are the kinds of things that I think these vendors will shortly be addressing. Before we get to the section on vendors, I just wanted to make a comment or two about actionability. I said earlier that payers are one step removed from care delivery here, except in a very, very small and narrow set of circumstances. And payers struggle, frankly, to get the kind of engagement from providers that they need to really, deliver better performance. You very often will hear about this problem in the context of filling HEDIS care gaps. So HEDIS performance improvement it's important for payers and plans. It's part of their accreditation process. It is also important to them in terms of driving better Medicare Advantage star ratings. Better thinking being that the higher your star rating, the more likely it is for Medicare beneficiaries to pick your plan during open enrollment, which is it's either just finished in the last day or two, or it may have been extended in some places. But I just want to emphasize that providers, they struggle to get their people to act based on the insights of products like these. So we hear all the time that individuals in provider organizations aren't always sure what to do about care gaps, for instance. Maybe that's because there's, for a given patient, there may be so many. There may be certain kinds of care gaps for which they're unusual and people aren't quite sure who should be addressing them. The point is, I think, is the payers, I think for the most part, are trying to devise focused kinds of programs and interventions that make it as easy and straightforward as possible for providers. Now I want to talk about some more about the companies that are in this market. So these are the vendors that we profile in this report. This is, obviously there are more vendors in this market that show up here. And we are hoping to include more vendors in future versions of this report. As I indicated earlier, we grouped these vendors into 3 different categories. Claims analytics vendors have been in this market for, in some cases, decades. They rely entirely on payer data sources, primarily paid claims. They are the largest vendors in this report by revenue, and most of them provide a lot more than just analytics and reporting. They provide things like risk models, clearinghouse services, utilization, case management services. They do a lot of different things. They tend to be diversified companies. But a handful of them are relatively new entrants to this market and really, I think, are pushing the envelope in terms of what it's possible to do with just claims data alone. The clinical analytics vendors have their roots in data aggregation and supporting analytics and reporting for VBC and other kinds of managed care programs. Many established themselves selling into provider type organizations and have expanded into selling to payer type organizations. Their kind of experience with accessing and using EHR data sources is attractive, obviously, to payer organizations. And we feel like these companies, the clinical analytics vendors, are really in the best position at this point to execute on that idea of providing a general purpose healthcare data provisioning capability. Many of these vendors also have fairly strong care management applications that are pretty well integrated with these analytics products. So it really lets them dig into activities like filling care gaps. The technology-enabled services vendors generally provide pretty customized solutions to, for the most part, large organizations. These solutions really lead with services rather than technology, and as a rule, the smaller payers or plans are not necessarily able or willing to invest in solutions from these companies, but there are certainly exceptions to that rule. To generalize across these vendors, the product portfolios that we see were either kind of general purpose or focused on a more narrow set of purposes. The general purpose products often had a kind of a payer or plan enterprise perspective. They let a health insurer keep track of multiple lines of business, multiple product types, different channels and geographies. They tended to be claims only type products. They also provide a lot of different ways to look at the data with a pretty large number of filters and query criteria. Special purpose product portfolios, on the other hand, have a narrower, usually VBC type focus. The prototypical narrow purpose payer analytics product supports quality and cost performance in a Medicare Advantage contract. So it's got information on all of the pertinent HEDIS measures and provides an ability to kind of put information in the hands of people who are able to close those quality gaps. They also tend to be pretty good at finding opportunities to optimize RAF scores and treating those as care gaps. These products usually feature clinical data sources, so EHR data in one way or another. They tend to have a smaller or narrower set of filters or query criteria, but there are a handful of very notable exceptions to this observation. I want to talk a little bit about the importance of patient cohorts. Patient cohorts are something that the vendors don't necessarily talk about, but we kind of feel like they have a very central place in analytics and reporting. And we've got most of these products kind of come into the world with a particular kind of set of cohorts cooked in. Most of the products have a cohort focus that is, like you kind of see on this slide, the most advanced products or the most advanced vendors, the most forward-looking vendors will support this kind of focus, but they also provide fairly flexible ways to find new cohorts, subset existing cohorts, define new cohorts, and then use the products of that kind of segmentation. And now, we've sort of gone on the record here, not uncontroversially, I have to admit that this aggregated clinical and claims data is going to be the minimum data set. And we really feel like in order to get the maximum value from that data store, organizations are going to need more flexible ways to kind of find, build, and use different cohorts for a lot of different reasons. And an important part of this will be providing a better support for developers and analysts who need to build applications based on cohorts that could be changing over time and with different criteria. So let's dive into the different categories just a little bit. Claims analytics vendors, as I said, they've been in the market longest. Many are very well-established brands, strong reputations. These companies are very much attuned to performance improvement needs of the payer in terms of driving better business outcomes. These products are very good at processing payer data sources at scale and providing exhaustive exploration and discovery of healthcare costs and utilization. They've always provided the most complete, if less detailed, view of each patient in the sense that the data reflects anything that's happened across multiple care delivery organizations and venues. From that standpoint, they can help folks zero in on all of the different drivers of costs. They also have broad abilities to help a payer or plan find instances and as well as patterns of fraud, waste, and abuse. Clinical analytics vendors are good at leveraging clinical data sources. They are also good at dealing with payer data sources. Many of these vendors kind of establish themselves in different kinds of population health or value-based care programs. In particular, the advent of ACOs has forced providers and payers to kind of adopt this common view of cost and quality performance. And ACO reporting needed both claims and clinical data sources. But these products have been adapted to other different kinds of pay for reporting or shared revenue, shared risk programs. Medicare Advantage, managed care contracts have they've generated demand for these vendors. The clinical analytics vendors have certainly been successful in provider organizations, but they've also, at least most of the ones in this report, have seen some demand from payers who are trying to roll out VBC programs for their provider partners. And just to mention here, there are a lot of vendors out there running around selling analytics. Not all vendors with the clinical background are able to deal with payer data sources. Payer data has a range of quality, consistency issues that, frankly, a lot of vendors with clinical backgrounds can't really, don't really have enough experience with. The companies in this report have track record of being able to kind of ingest and use these payer data sources. As I said earlier, technology-enabled services vendors lead with services. They tend to sell to the largest payers. They've got process outsourcing, application development outsourcing, utilization and case management backgrounds, and they are part of this report. So let's talk about our broad conclusions about all these different vendors. So we have a thing coming up here in 2 slides called the Chilmark Bearing. Chilmark Bearing is based on evaluations of these vendors along 2 dimensions: product capabilities and market execution. On this slide, we've got product capabilities. Every single vendor in this report has there's no way to sugarcoat it. They have a pretty ornate product set. No 2 vendors have exactly the same set of capabilities. So to provide a reasonable way to compare unlike product sets, we came up with what you're seeing here, 16 different categories of product capabilities. They are generic, and these are all of the factors that go into developing a product capabilities rating. Similarly, on kind of the market execution side, that's the second dimension of our vendor evaluation. It's based on these categories. We look at how large the vendor's market footprint is, its roadmap and what it's planning to do in the future, as well as its history in terms of delivering on that roadmap, the different kinds of services that it offers, how extensively its customers engage with the company, and how it's done in terms of acquiring new customers. So those are the 2 elements: product capabilities and market execution, and these together form our Chilmark Bearing. It has pretty high-level conclusions about these vendors in this market. The x-axis is essentially the product capability score. There were 16 different factors that go into where a particular vendor ends up along the x-axis. In general, we feel like the vendors towards the right of this graph have more functional offerings than those who are over towards the left. The y-axis is market execution. In general, the vendors toward the top, as you increase along the y-axis, those vendors have executed more strongly historically in the market. So what we can say broadly about the bearing and how the consequences of being a clinical analytics vendor or a claims analytics vendor or a technology-enabled services vendor is that the traditional claims analytics vendors have had more market success, primarily because they've been in the market for a long time. The clinical analytics vendors in general have more functional offerings, we'd say at this point. But it's important to note that not one of these vendors is kind of sitting on their hands. Every one of them has forward-looking roadmaps and are investing in new capabilities and trying to expand their sales and marketing efforts. And just to kind of give you an example, some of the relatively new entrants here are use only claims data, notwithstanding what we said about aggregated clinical and claims data. These are companies, and the 2 examples I can think of off the top of my head would be Clarify Health and Certalytics. They have a very strong offering, especially with respect to predictive analytics. Another set of vendors that's not well represented in this, that I think will become more represented as time goes by, are the EHR vendors. For now, only Cerner is on this chart, but I expect other EHR vendors to become a lot more involved in this market, and I do expect they are in a position that I think many of the other vendors here are not in, with respect to having the ability to invest heavily in product over a fairly short period of time. So to kind of wrap up here, we've said that aggregated clinical and claims data is going to be table stakes as value-based care, value-based reimbursement becomes more pervasive. The sort of oncoming rush of social determinants, precision metadata is only going to add more impetus to this idea of providing analytics data ready for these kinds of applications. I'd be remiss to not mention that getting provider organizations to cooperate with payers is a difficult and not imperfectly solved problem. We think these products are really good at surfacing quality-based care gaps. There's not a lot of attention being paid to care coordination, even though a lot of these gaps purport to have something to do with care coordination. We feel like as people get better at defining quality and dealing with quality issues, these products are going to need to provide a more system-type perspective to care coordination in general. Predictive capabilities we really feel like we're at the infancy of predictive capabilities. It should be possible to use data to kind of design and build a plan. A lot of these products don't necessarily have big fans among the actuarial crowd. These products could be used to identify and build high-performance clinician networks, find new members, and execute the plans all as an integrated whole. The current kind of siloed approach, both to the source applications and the analytics, is going to have to give way to an approach that encourages kind of optimization across the life cycle of a health plan. Finally, we think prediction accuracy is going to increasingly be a competitive differentiator and an area of scrutiny for buyers of this technology. So with that, I would like to throw it open for questions or comments.
Yes, thank you, Brian. If you have any questions for Brian about the state of the market, differences or similarities between any of these different kinds of products for both providers or payers, for those of you who are familiar with our research on provider analytics as well, or anything else about the state of analytics, please let us know through the questions tab in your GoToWebinar panel. To start off, Brian, going off those analysts or the conclusions you just shared, can you share more of the prominent differences between products from claims analytics and clinical analytics vendors, and what buyers need to keep in mind as they evaluate products in those different categories?
One of the things that when you kind of look at as many demos as we have, that kind of jumps out at you is that the products from the claims analytics vendors need work in terms of their user interfaces. So the clinical analytics vendors have frankly better, easier to use products. It is also pretty clear that those claims analytics vendors, they recognize this. They're not, as I said, sitting on their hands. We're starting to see, and we'll probably see over the next year or so, new front ends for these products. But that's one area that kind of really jumps out.
Thanks, Brian. Going off of that, given the close competition among these vendors, do you expect vendor consolidation to increase among these vendors or in this particular market?
I think that's an interesting question. I honestly think that, put it this way, I don't see a massive wave of consolidation. I mean, if you look over the long sweep of, say, 5 years, not that long, but there are a bunch of companies that have tried to enter this market that weren't successful. Honestly, the vendors that are in this report, and there's a tendency on the part of people to interpret things like our Chilmark Bearing as the people who don't look good in that are somehow not good. That's false. These are fairly serious companies with, I think, fairly serious product offerings. And I'd be surprised if any of them disappear under the waves or get absorbed into somebody else. But that said, the biggest players in healthcare applications, folks like the large claims analytics vendors, the EHR vendors are, they have a habit of buying companies. But the short answer is not massive amounts of consolidation, because I do think it is, again, because I do think it is early days in some respects.
Thank you. Going back to broader functionality in the market, where do you see market level efforts to improve the quality and timeliness of the data payers and providers need to share for VBC? And going off of that as well, can you talk more about how payers and providers share data with the analytics vendors?
On the first part, yeah, so moving data around the healthcare system is a fraught process. I think one of the things we sort of glossed over here in this presentation is data quality. Vendors who are traditionally good at EHR type data, they have, they've lived through the wars in terms of trying to turn EHR source data into something that's useful. Similarly, the claims analytics vendors have developed all kinds of processes to deal with how dirty and inconsistent these data sources are. I mean, I do think that there is an effort on part of these vendors and the companies that they're working with to try to clean this stuff up at its source. But for now, that's not an easy problem. It requires a great deal of skill. It requires vendors who really kind of double down on investing in the quality of the data that they're producing for their customers. And the second part of that question was?
Just more about data sharing in general.
Oh, so data sharing, and so data sharing is a weird thing. I will say that, for instance, when we talk about this need for aggregated clinical and claims data, frankly, when you say that to the vendors who, these traditional claims analytics vendors, look, we get a certain amount of stony silence as a response. The providers are not forthcoming with this kind of data unless they absolutely have to be. I'm not sure that the new interoperability rules coming out of DC will necessarily solve all problems, but between them and just it does seem like the feds are force marching providers into downside risk. And at which point I do think that will start to concentrate some minds and make providers in particular recognize that they need to be a little bit more forthcoming in terms of making their data useful in more different contexts.
Moving on to kinds of data, do you see a standard data set emerging when analyzing SDOH? And if so, is zip code on that list?
So SDOH is a very interesting category because it is an undefined category. I think that the detailed components of what could, should, or might be considered SDOH, the value of those different elements for certain kinds of predictions in certain kinds of contexts is, those are all sort of open and unexplored questions. So SDOH is, in some respects, I think, in the final analysis, it may turn out that SDOH is far more valuable than paid claims and EHR type data. Clearly, we're not there yet, but it does seem like these vendors and these products are beginning to use this kind of data. But there does, as an industry, there probably needs to be more discussion about both the specific elements that should be included and how those elements are used. What is your view of companies' analytics?
Or first, can we talk more about the quality measures that are there quality measures that take into account patient preferences, as both payers and increasingly providers are using these solutions?
I believe it or not, I don't have an encyclopedic knowledge of HEDIS or other more clinically oriented quality measures. So I don't know, I can't answer that off the top of my head. So if we take Medicare Advantage for example, there's a certain set of HEDIS measures that go into that. The other part of that, the other big part of that is essentially patient satisfaction. So patients will usually fill out surveys, HCAHPS and other kinds of surveys after they've had some sort of encounter, and the plan is then evaluated based on how happy or sad the patient is with the care that they received. Now that doesn't necessarily answer the question specifically. Patient preference in general is often a conversation between physician or nurse and patient. But I do think that patient preferences, for instance, could and should be included as a social and behavioral determinant. But for now, I'm challenged to think of a specific instance of that. If any, I'd be delighted to hear from anybody who's got a different view on that issue.
Okay, and then we don't really talk about comparative analytics and reporting. Is that something that comes up with these solutions?
So by comparative analytics, I'm going to leap to the conclusion, perhaps wrong, that you're talking about comparative effectiveness. And I think the short answer is no. As a kind of a central organizing, or even as a kind of a major feature set inside these products, we do see comparative effectiveness coming out of fairly small vendors, and that will frequently be applied at the level of, say, very large populations where there's information about different care pathways that different providers may have taken. But no, I don't think that comparative effectiveness is a big part of what payer analytics is about. I think it should be. I think too much of the emphasis now is on cost variability, and I think that when it's all said and done, the costs may just be the highest level manifestation of what are effectively different ways of kind of dealing with similarly situated patients.
All right, and last question. When you evaluate the vendors, do you take into account their ability to execute or a successful implementation versus
so we try to stay as concrete as possible in terms of our market execution. So we are kind of looking at how many customers they have, how many customers have they had recently. So I understand that one of our major competitors likes to throw around ability to execute. I think we're a little bit more focused on what has been executed.
Thanks. With that, we have reached the end of our time. Thank you everyone for your questions, and I'm sorry we did not get to all of them. If you'd like to follow up with Brian afterwards, please leave a comment in the follow-up survey right after we end, and he will get back to you as soon as possible. Coming up next in the new year, Chilmark will publish reports on these important topics. Most notably, Brian will be working on the next generation interoperable platforms market trends report, scheduled for Q1 or Q2, the borderline. And with that, thank you for attending. For more information on this report on payer analytics solutions and a deeper evaluation of all the vendor offerings, including full profiles that went into that chart, the Chilmark Bearing, I encourage you to check out the full report. The link is on your screen, and I will also include it in my follow-up email along with the slide deck and a recording of this presentation. Thank you for joining.